Hi, my name is Mathelinda Nabugodi, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Cambridge. I work on Percy Bysshe Shelley, and so he will be my reference point today, but I hope that my talk will have a bearing on working on dead white men in general. I want to begin with a quote from another dead man, Theodore Adorno. Philosophy, which once seemed obsolete, lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. Similarly, I would say, anti-racist activism, which should have become obsolete a long time ago, lives on because we continually fail to realize racial justice. Living On is also, as I'm sure many of you will know, the title of Jacques Derrida's reading of Shelley's last poem, The Triumph of Life. Generally, readers have agreed that the poem displays the failures and self-delusions of Western civilization. So can this poem help us understand the undead nature of racism and other forms of structural oppression? This question is easy for me to ask. Suspiciously easy, I would say. The question is also very easy to answer. Yeah, sure, of course. Reading Shelley can provide some sort of insight into racism then and now. In many ways, that is the premise of our discipline, that texts from the past, in some sense, speak to our present. And this is regardless of what Shelley himself may or may not have thought about race. Although he was by all accounts slightly more woke than the average Englishman around 1800, but beyond a kind of novel savage Orientalism, I don't think that he thought very much about race at all. Therefore, the question arises, with what kind of violence are we making his poetry speak to our present anti-racist agenda? Let me be clear. I couldn't care less about whether our interpretation of Shelley's poetry is true to his authorial intentions or whether it is anachronistic in some way. What concerns me here are our own critical intentions in reading anti-racism into Shelley's work. And again, Shelley is here representative for any dead white romantic. The cultural productions and radical politics of the Romantic era are coeval with an equally radical white supremacism that served to justify European colonial expansion across the globe. As we are forced to come to terms with this unpleasant aspect of the Romantic period, I think that for us as scholars and critics, there is some consolation to be had from ascertaining that, although it was written in a racist epoch, Shelley's poetry is not inherently racist. After all, today, the accusation of being a racist is often deemed worse than racist behavior. Thus, rather than asking whether the triumph of life can teach us anything about race, I would like us to consider another question. Does our self-therapeutic desire to read proto-anti-racism into the work of Shelley and other Romantic era authors perpetuate the violation of all the Africans, Asians, Australians, Native Americans, and other indigenous peoples who were brutally raped, enslaved, and murdered by Europeans in the Romantic period? That is, while Shelley himself was in Italy writing poetry. To answer that question, we need to articulate the connection between the interpretative violence of an anti-racist reading of Romantic poetry and the actual violence against Black bodies in the Romantic period and in our own present. After the Black Lives Matter protests erupted across the world last summer, many universities and other institutions hurried to proclaim their solidarity. Suddenly, confessional books on everyday racism by Black authors were topping the bestseller charts. Commenting on the surge of interest in anti-racism, Saidiya Hartman observed in an interview in Art Forum that I will quote. So this is Hartman's words. What we see now is a translation of Black suffering into white pedagogy. In this extreme moment, the casual violence that can result in a loss of life, a police officer literally killing a Black man with the weight of his knees on the other's neck, becomes a flashpoint for a certain kind of white liberal conscience, like, oh my God, we're living in a racist order. How can I find out more about this? End quote. This online roundtable is part of this translation of Black suffering into white pedagogy. So when I ask about the violence with which we would wish for Romantic texts to speak to our own anti-racist commitments, I'm not primarily thinking about the metaphorical violence of a misinterpretation or a misreading, but the literal violence wielded by the state against Black bodies. A violence that is part of the ongoing living legacy of colonialism and the slave trade. Because let's face it, before the killing of George Floyd and its aftermath, would it have been imaginable for the Keats-Shelley Association of America to host a roundtable towards an anti-racist, undisciplined romanticism. Again, I need to be clear. I think that this roundtable is an important and timely intervention in the debates on racial justice, and I'm very honored to have been invited to take part. I just want to sound a note of caution about the ease with which we adapt the rhetoric of undisciplining. As is made clear in the blurb for this roundtable, the word undisciplined enters our conversation via an editorial by Chatterjee, Christoph, and Wong, published in the LA Review of Books. There, it is a citation from Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being. This book addresses the continuities between Black being in slavery and Black being in America today, the key argument being that Black Americans exist in the wake of the slave ship. I'm going to read from the relevant passage because I think it is very important to think about the context in which Sharp calls for us to become undisciplined. So these are Sharp's words. Our knowledge of slavery and Black being in slavery is gained from our studies, yes, but also in excess of those studies. It is gained through the kinds of knowledge from and of the everyday. We are expected to discard, discount, disregard, jettison, abandon those ways of knowing and to enact epistemic violence that we know to be violence against others and ourselves. In other words, for Black academics, to pursue legible work in the academy often means doing violence to our own capacities to read, think, and imagine otherwise. Despite knowing otherwise, we are often disciplined into thinking through and along lines that reinscribe our own annihilation, reinforcing and reproducing what Sylvia Wynter has called our narratively condemned status. We must become undisciplined. The work we do requires new modes and methods of research and teaching, new ways of entering and leaving the archives of slavery, of undoing the racial calculus that was entrenched centuries ago and that lives on into the present. End quote. As Sharp uses it, becoming undisciplined is a way of acknowledging Black ways of knowing that cannot be contained by the white academy, and more specifically when it comes to the archives of slavery. Unlearning academic discipline is a way of tapping into the living tradition and heritage of Black persons in the wake of the slave ship. This brings me to the final question. In what sense is the scholarship on British Romanticism, and the discipline of English more widely perhaps, themselves located in the wake of British Romanticism? One of the aims of this roundtable is, of course, to acknowledge that the Romantic era witnessed the consolidation of racialized capitalism that lives on in the form of neocolonialism and systemic racism today. But the period also witnessed the foundation of the modern research-led university. This entailed the development of new professional standards for research, focused on the ideals of objectivity and scientific method, concepts that turned the experience of white, financially privileged, predominantly male subjects into the universal measure of knowledge. My own university education has been oriented towards attaining this ideal of universal objectivity. In other words, becoming an academic has been a process of learning to occupy the objective subject position of scholarly discourse, historically the preserve of white men. To be quite honest with you, nothing in my academic training has taught me how to be a scholar of British Romanticism and a Black woman at the same time. It's always either or. And this is, of course, precisely why Sharp contends that we need to undiscipline ourselves in order to theorize Black being. But for this reason, I also worry that we are all too easily assimilating Sharp's call to become undisciplined to an in itself rather romantic, rebellious aesthetics, without thinking through the extent to which our scholarly personas are in fact located in the wake of the oppression that we would so counter. That is the extent to which we, in our capacity as academics, are perpetuating the notion of white European intellectual superiority that has profoundly shaped the development of the modern university. This is why the question I posed at the outset about whether Shelley's The Triumph of Life speaks to our own time's anti-racist concerns is so easy to ask. It remains within the knowledge paradigm of our discipline, according to which writing, produced by white men, is universally applicable. What I do not know how to ask is the more difficult question of how we could learn to know otherwise. I hope that this is something that we will be addressed in the roundtable. Thank you very much for listening.